This is sort of comes back to why I got so involved and so obsessed with this, is because particularly the nuclear power ban is crazy, and I hope everyone can come to that conclusion. You don't have to agree with the coalition's policy, and certainly we've got our own, suggestions in terms of the coalition policy where we think it could be slightly different and stuff.
Well, do you want to elaborate on what the coalition's policy is? Because I think a lot of people have seen the headlines, but unfortunately nowadays most people, including I will admit myself, do not always read through the whole article, especially if it's paywalled. Yeah. What is their policy?
So the coalition policy basically is a proposal where they've identified 7 locations around Australia where all of which are either have coal plants or have had, coal communities for nuclear power plants. Now those communities in Queensland are Billawheeler, which is the Callab Power Station. You've then got Tarong. Then in New South Wales, you've got the Hunter and Lithgow. In Victoria, you've got the Latrobe Valley. In South Australia, you've got Port Augusta, and in WA, there's Collie. So hopefully that amounts to 7. Good. So those are the 7 locations that they've identified. Then there's a few extra layers to it. There's also a bit of confusion from some people around it as well. But my understanding is that whilst they've identified all of these sites, there'll be about a 2-year process where there'll be an independent nuclear authority or whatever, which investigates all these sites and then chooses the appropriate ones for nuclear power plants. So my understanding, again, I preface my understanding is I don't think all of these sites would actually be used for nuclear power plants, is how I read it. And what it would basically mean is, so you'd have that independent authority, you then obviously have to have the regulator established. They'd immediately lift the nuclear power bans, is my understanding.
I'd assume so, yeah.
Yeah, and I think they might also have some constitutional authority to force that on the states and lift the state-based prohibitions. But then in addition to that, there would then be a community, so I think there'd then be a community fund established, so they'd get better infrastructure and all of these kind of things when the power plants are built. And then they've got a time frame for, I think it's 10 to 15 years for the first nuclear power plant to be built in Australia. And that's consistent with the International Atomic Energy Agency's time frame. They've got this milestones report, which basically is used by countries which don't have nuclear power for them to basically, what are the steps to get nuclear power? The International Atomic Energy Agency is the UN's organisation responsible for nuclear. So they've got this report, it says 10 to 15 years, and Australia would follow that as well. So then the other aspects of it are that I think nuclear would be about 1/3 of the grid.
Oh, okay.
Then there would be about, I think it's 60% or so renewables, and then the remainder is gas and storage. And this was recent. They sort of then packaged all of this into 2 reports by Frontier Economics. There was one into the cost of the current all renewables plan, where they basically said AEMO's prediction that the basically 100% renewables rollout is going to cost $121 billion is unrealistic, and here are these other costs. And then they had a second report which said, now we've modelled nuclear into these scenarios, and we've found that an energy mix with nuclear would have a lower cost than one with renewables.
I've heard from some people in the public sphere that that's a bit of a fudging of the numbers, that it's not like for like that's being compared.
Yeah.
What's your opinion on that?
The interesting thing with Frontier Economics, now the coalition had this headline, which I think it was something like a 40% cost reduction with nuclear or something, maybe 44% or something, really big number. Now, how they got to that number is, and there's some important background, is AEMO, which is the organisation which manages the East Coast grid. They have this report. It's called the Integrated Systems Plan. Now, we could talk about it for ages. I'm probably not the best expert on it, but basically, yeah, they came up with this figure that by 2050, it's going to cost $121 billion to decarbonise the economy, pretty much. And they had these series of scenarios, including, step change, progressive change, all these different scenarios for what kind of energy mixes you'd use to be able to get to that. And basically, the government prefers the step change, which is a more rapid decarbonisation with more electrification. And that also means that there's, they predict a larger energy demand by 2050 because they're predicting that more people will be driving electric cars and more people will electrify their homes. There's also this progressive change, which is, so step change is what Labor prefers. What Coalition prefer and what they think is more realistic is a progressive change where less people are going to, transition to electric cars and all those kind of things. Now, that's a policy difference. That's got nothing to do with nuclear. That's just the Coalition think that this is more realistic and that they prefer this happening in real life with electrification, all this kind of stuff. Then Labor's like, no, we actually think more people will electrify and there'll therefore be larger demand. Now, in this report, what the Coalition did is they then costed Labor's plan, the step change plan without nuclear, as compared to the progressive plan with nuclear energy. And what that meant...
Two variables, you can't tell which one is the determining factor.
It's helpful, I guess, if you're making a vote for a political party, because it's like, well, Labor's plan will cost this much and Coalition's plan will cost this much, but it is apples and oranges. It is different. But the important thing is that was the headline, but there was then, what Frontier Economics also did was then compared the step change with nuclear as compared to step change without, and progressive change with nuclear as compared to progressive change without. And both times they found around about a 25% cost reduction with nuclear in those. So that's apples, both of those are clearly apples with apples. The same energy demand in both scenarios, and they still found a 25% cost saving. So
not as much as the apples and oranges, but still a cost reduction.
So personally, I think, I think that was mishandled by the Coalition, and that's something that we won't get involved with because we're not here to say that we want more Australians to, drive electric cars or whatever. We're a nuclear advocacy organisation.
Fair enough.
So from our position, the most powerful thing is that, 25%, because it still shows a quite significant cost reduction. But importantly, that's something that's reinforced around the world. So the US recently did a report, the Advanced Nuclear Liftoff Report, and they found that in a California situation, they had a 30%, so system costs with nuclear as compared to without nuclear in a balanced energy mix had a 37% cost reduction. So the important thing to underscore is what this report showed by Frontier, which is consistent with other kind of reports, is that nuclear does lower total system costs in energy mixes. And that's not the same as power bills, but generally that then means that power bills would also then be lower as a result of nuclear power in the mix.
And the system's cost is to maintain it, to build it and maintain it?
Pretty much. So in Frontier Economics report, they had basically a figure which they used for nuclear, like an input cost, which was, so they had that figure, and then they also had another figure for operating costs. They intentionally, from my understanding, made it quite a large amount so they could also factor in waste management costs and stuff and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, there's both of those aspects there. But it's very, very complex space.